Good afternoon. Today is Wednesday, the 16th of April, 2025, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. Delighted to have Ben Rubin with me in the studio, and we will be joined by Vanessa Beeley and Sandy Adams on Live Link. Now, we're just going to say that a lot to cover on today's news. For the presenters, the theme which is recurrent for us is that whilst we see more and more terrible events in the world, whether it's in Ukraine or in the Middle East, what we think we are watching is the dismantling of society and infrastructure in UK. But we've got quite a busy news today. We'll be talking about the Cambridge Peace Conference on the Ukraine Russia proxy war. We're going to be having a look at the clampdown on free speech in Glastonbury. We'll be looking at diplomacy in Antalya. And we're also going to be looking at the rise of free ports, and also a very interesting section about how Israel is now going to look after our mental health. Let's get started with the peace conference. Of course, this is not the sort of thing that you're going to see on the BBC, but UK Column team were delighted to be invited not only to help arrange this conference, but also to speak. And absolutely beautiful environment in Jesus College, Cambridge. But as you can see there, amongst the tranquility of that setting, of course, the subject was the brutal, absolutely brutal war, the proxy war, which the West is still determined to keep running in Ukraine. Now, I want to say that basically we had a number of speakers, some of them ex-military, some of them diplomats, some of them professionals who've lived in Ukraine. Major General Valery here retired. He's on the right of the screen, making a case that this war really should never have happened, and it's not a good thing for America. We also had the retired Indian Major General Bakshi. UK Column has interviewed General Bakshi, extremely interesting man, giving his perspective on how this war got started and why it needs to be stopped as soon as possible. But we also had some really serious concerns, and the lady in front of behind the lectern, Dr. Deepti Bisht, who did a tremendous amount of work to get this conference together, was warning about the really serious side of the Ukrainian conflict, because both the United States and the Russians have had concerns about dirty nuclear weapons. And of course, this is something which the longer the conflict goes on, the greater the risk. Let's just hear a little bit about what she was saying at the conference. We should have a little video clip here, I think. Okay, unfortunately, we haven't got that clip to show you, but essentially the point is that the possibility of a dirty bomb, a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, has been something that has arisen and has been of concern to both the Americans and the Russians as a result of statements made by the Ukrainians themselves. Again, this is a subject which the BBC simply doesn't want to cover. But other subjects that were brought to the surface in this very interesting conference were the concerns about the US biolabs in Ukraine. And if we just have a look at this one slide that was part of a really excellent talk about this problem, it says that on March the 10th, 2022, senior defense officials spoke about the Department of Defense's cooperative biological threat reduction program activities in Ukraine. And it says that the DoD has been working with the Ukrainian government since 2005 to secure 5 biological research laboratories in Kiev. And we've invested nearly $200 million in Ukraine since 2005, supporting 46 Ukrainian labs. So this was regarded as a huge problem. Now, I want to say that the conference itself was balanced, because while we had people who were concerned about what was happening, if you like, from the Russian side, we also had people speaking, such as Ms. Lopez, former US diplomat, talking about what the US policy is for Eastern Europe. And her talk was extremely interesting. It gives you some idea of the mindset in deep state America, and the fear, really, of the Russians. Let's also just have a look at a little clip by George Galloway, who had a very interesting opening statement for the audience.
Well, thank you very much, not just for the invitation and for the introduction, but for the video that you just showed, and especially what you said immediately afterwards, that it was made 2 years ago. It spoke clearly as if it were made today. The fact that it was made 2 years ago shows both the prescience and the courage of the participants. Because 2 years ago, never mind 2 years ago, 6 months ago, these would have been described as Putin talking points. We would have been accused of being literal agents of the Russian state. For voicing that narrative, we would have been shadow banned, outright banned. If we'd booked this room, it would have been cancelled. If we'd held this conference, there would have been a protest outside. We would have been blackguarded by what still calls itself the mainstream media. Everything that was said there turned out to be true, and moreover is now the prevailing orthodoxy.
So George Galloway's key point was that just a few years ago, if you dared to speak out on the subject of Ukraine, the BBC and other Western media were simply going to label you as a Putin's puppet. But of course, all the warnings that people have been making over the way the conflict would go, it has gone, and we've seen the resulting slaughter on the battlefield. So just a small section there of a really excellent talk by George Galloway. But the other person who had a really interesting commentary was Andrew Bridgen. Let's have a little listen.
So what truth aren't we being told, or the public aren't being told? And I don't believe my colleagues are being told, my former colleagues in the House of Commons are being told. Well, for most of the public and for most MPs, the conflict in Ukraine started on the 24th of February 2022 when Russia invaded. That is their timeline. It is interesting that was about 6 hours after we'd just gone out of the last emergency, which was the COVID pandemic, which was officially ended at midnight on the 24th. And 6 hours later, we were into the next emergency, which was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As various people have said, in 1991, at the end of the Cold War, in return for allowing Germany to re-amalgamate East and West Germany, we promised the then Russian leader that we would not move NATO and European Union an inch east of Germany. We broke that. We broke that agreement, the Minsk agreement. We broke that. We broke it repeatedly. We broke it with the Baltic states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, and everything else.
So interesting commentary there from Andrew Bridge. And again, you will not hear this sort of commentary on the BBC or the mainstream media in the UK because free speech is suppressed. Now, I'd just like to bring this lady on screen, Lucy Morgan-Edwards. She has huge experience of working in Afghanistan, and she gave a really excellent talk pointing out effectively how the mainstream media had completely lied about the situation in Afghanistan. Let's just have a listen to a little clip of Lucy speaking.
So what truth aren't we being told, or the public aren't being told? And I don't believe my colleagues are being told, my former colleagues in the House of Commons are being told.
Of women. So of course the Afghan intervention was sold very, very heavily to the Western public as being about the protection of women and about the transition to democracy and so on. It was none of that. And I can tell you because I was there for,
So the point Lucy was making was that the mainstream media tried to say a lot of what was happening with Afghanistan was about the creation of democracy and help for women in society. But her experience on the ground was that was absolutely not what was happening. Now, I'll just emphasize a little bit more that a key part of the conference was to get people speaking about Ukraine instead of a one-sided delivery. And one of the points being made was that the Ukrainians had been taught to hate the Russians. This was part of a BBC interview where effectively one of Ukrainian policymaker was describing Russians living within the LPR and DPR, Donetsk People's Republic, Lugansk People's Republic, as scum. The BBC clearly helping to whip up the hatred here. And this is a key point, that the Ukrainians have been taught to hate the Russians. How's this taken place? Well, part of my own talk was to have a look at how propaganda has been working around this conflict. And so this was the key part of what I had to say. We've got a Western media bias, which is essentially that anything to do with the West is good, Ukraine is good, but anything to do with the Russians is bad. And I asked the audience if this was just propaganda or mind control, and I pointed out to them it was both. So at the end of the day, if you can change the mindset of the Ukrainians, they become lambs for the slaughter. And what I described in the talk was UK's stealth attack on Ukraine. And I used a lot of material that many of our viewers will have seen before. I'm pointing out that the BBC, of course, in BBC monitoring works alongside UK intelligence services who are working alongside the American intelligence services, such as the NSA. And I've also pointed out how this stealth attack on Ukraine has worked. With UK's BBC Media Action helping drive change in Ukraine, money coming in for soft power change via the Department for International Development. We've got UK programme assistance regarding banking and conditional loans coming in. We've got the EU pumping in its propaganda and control. And of course, we've also got the weapons coming in. And what does that achieve? Well, ultimately, that achieves the proxy war. So the Ukrainians led to believe that freedom and democracy are in the West. We who live in the West know that's not true. And at the end of the day, it's those Ukrainians that are dying, being slaughtered on the battlefield for the West proxy war. I also reminded people that the BBC, even in pushing out its commentary on the war through maps, is using the Institute for the Study of War, itself linked into the American Enterprise Institute. And if we look at the family members associated with this, we come back to Victoria Nuland, coming from a Ukrainian family, but of course she's been the ace war hawk from the time of the revolution, and BBC Media Action in on the ground amongst Ukrainian society. If we have a look at it from a different aspect, we can put Zelensky at the centre here. This is a Western propaganda game where the BBC controls what is known as Ukraine, quote, independent media. But we've also got the pressure of the likes of Victoria Nuland and Nina Jankovic, the former advisor to the Ukraine ministry, executive director from the Department of Homeland Security. So essentially, this is UK and US propaganda and mind control. And many in the audience at that event had no idea of the British political parties imposing applied psychology in order to change the mindset of the UK population. And this is something they've been boasting at for some time. So if we have a look at the minutes of the meetings during COVID, when applied psychology was being used to make people more frightened, to get them to adhere to lockdown, this was control of the British public by fear. But of course, what we seem to be looking at is control of the Ukrainian public by fear, and in particular, fear of the Russians themselves. And I think this is an ideal time to come across